And welcome back. As we continue looking at how to code with Python, let's go ahead and now transition to looking at how to use functions, but functions that don't require us to use parameters. So first off, just what is a function? Well, in languages like Java, we are familiar with these being called methods. And these methods, of course, define a block of code that can be used to complete a set of code that is executed when it's been invoked. In Python, though, we don't call these methods. We call these functions. And very much like methods, functions are going to be those same blocks of code which will only run when called. And of course, we can pass data or parameters into a function. We're not going to look at those today because, again, we want to look at just ones without those values because it'll be an easier way for us to transition into this. But, of course, functions can return data, all right? Whether or not they are, having an explicit return or we are going to have it perform some kind of calculation. So let's look at actually creating a function. In Python, a function is defined using the def keywords, so def. So, for example, we say def my function, and they have a just simple print line statement, or excuse me, a print statement. It just says hello from a function. Now, you might recognize this format because we've actually been using this in our programs. Every example I've been showing up to this point has been using this def keyword. So that you've seen this when I say def main, open close parentheses, semicolon. You'll notice that our functions are always going to follow this same kind of format. It's going to say def, it will have the name of the function, open and close parentheses to show that it is a function with no parameters, and then a semicolon. This function, of course, the main function, is a very special function because just like how we had in Java, we would have something like our public static void main string args. The main is what Python typically will use to identify which function to execute as the primary call. Now, there are, of course, other ways around this, but this is, of course, going to be the main one because technically you don't have to have a main function in your code, but if we are structuring our code very nicely and more organized, using something like the main function is a great way to approach that. Now, let's actually look at calling a function. All right, so to call a function, we're going to use the function name followed by parentheses. So let's just say we have, again, my function, and we're going to go ahead and print that same message we saw before. Well, how do we invoke that? Well, we just say whatever the name of that function is, in this case, my function, open and close parentheses. Now, we have called our main function, of course, the same way. Def main, we'll have some code, and then main. And so let's go ahead and pop right over into Visual Studio Code to actually look at this hands-on, because I think it'll be better to look at some function creation if we do this live. So we have, of course, this main function, which we could call. Now, there is ways, again, as I around it, but because we're learning, having this main be the primary function is the kind of best way for us to approach this right now. Now, what do we want this code to do? Let's just say our program, for our intents and purposes, is going to be a program that adds two numbers, something very simple. Well, I could, of course, do that here in this main function, not a problem. Or I can create another function that will handle that for me. So let's just say definition, so def, and we'll just say add two nums, open close parentheses, semicolon. Now, that is a very simple function there. Well, what do we want that function to do? Well, we wanted to get two numbers and add it. So let's go ahead and set up, let's just say we have int1, and this would be like, oh, let's actually, it's int1, we'll call it num1, just so we don't have to restrict ourselves. And we'll say that this is of type float, and we'll say this is an input, and we'll say please enter a number to be added. And then let's repeat that with a second prompt. So num2 goes float, and again I'm doing float because I want to have the possibility that they might want to enter in a decimal. And we'll say please enter a second number to be added. All right, now of course we can do what we do best, which is simply just return that value. So we could just simply print, because we don't need to store anything. We could print, and we can say num1 plus num2 is, and make sure we leave that space there, and we're going to concatenate in a string cast here of num1 plus num2. And then all I need to do to call this add two nums, because notice I have a main call down here, but I actually don't want to add that here at the bottom of the function. Instead, I actually want to replace this where I have this sum code. I'm going to instead change this to invoke the function. All right, and what function are we going to invoke? Well, we only have one other function currently in our program, which is add two nums. But just like before, I have to put those parentheses there because I needed to tell it, hey, I want you to call this function. Let's go ahead and give this a run and see if we made any mistakes. So I'm going to go ahead and run my program. It says enter a number to be added. Let's go ahead, since we said it's a float, let's do 2.5. Hit enter. A second number, let's go ahead and do about 4.5. And we get num1 plus num2 is 7.0. And that would be correct. So our function is working. And notice, we did not have to put it down here with this main call. If I had put this add two nums down here, if I had to put add two nums here, I can still technically do this, and it will technically work. Let me just go ahead and comment this line out here. So main doesn't really do anything. If I run it like this way, notice we do get a error here. All right, it says, oh no, we get an indentation error. So what's going on here? Well, it's because our main block doesn't really have anything in it now. So maybe I'll just add a quick print statement in here. Just have it print a blank line. All right, so now it's working because that main was thinking, hey, you have a main function here, but you don't have any code in it. All right, so we've cleaned that up. All right, so we just print out our blank line from our main, and you notice it's now calling this add two nums function. And this is what I was talking about when you don't necessarily have to have that main function. We could, of course, eliminate the main function and take this main call out of here and just have it def add two nums. It's not like Java where it needs strictly that public static void main string args. This program, in fact, I'm actually just going to, let's go ahead and just terminate this here. And whoop, clear that. I'm just going to go ahead and, for now, let's just comment out. I'm going to take this print statement out here completely. But let's just go ahead and comment out the function and its invocation. And if I just run this, we notice it jumps right into, please enter a number to be added. You don't need to have the main identifier there. However, for us programming, it can make it very helpful because it tells me, okay, which is this main function I'm going to be operating with. So I'm just going to go ahead and kill this again and bring back my main here. Again, having the main function is very helpful because as we start building our programs and making them more robust, we're going to want to have our functions set up in a way that we can invoke them from, for example, the main, or maybe there's other functions that we want to invoke inside of those functions. So for example, maybe there's another function I have and I want it to have it work through add two nums. You know, maybe I have one that's called like get numeric input, and I'm going to pass it back in. And that's, of course, going to lead us into this conversation of eventually using parameters. And because maybe instead of having the numbers get done here, maybe this function is simply going to do the adding. Which means we're going to need to get these values. I could have another function. But again, we are going to need to know how to start using some different variables. We're going to have to understand how to use parameters. But this is a good start for us to understand how functions work. But again, we're going to need to real quickly start getting to using parameters because it's going to give us a whole lot more features and functionality, just like we're used to using when we had to use methods.